You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome everybody once again to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, tell your friends about us, share and like our episodes. We love all of that interaction. And do send us your comments and questions. You can post them underneath the YouTube video or email them to us. And I guess at some point, Todd, we will come back and we'll do another Q&A episode. We haven't done one for a while. And we love going through all of your questions and thinking about those. So yeah, so send us your comments and engagements. That's brilliant. Okay, now today we've got a really interesting topic. We're actually digging into history here, Todd. We are going to be thinking about a movement of creationist geologists who were active in the 19th century and thinking about their significance, both historically, but also for us today as creationists. They're a group known as the Scriptural Geologists, or the Mosaic Geologists, they're sometimes referred to. And in order to sort of help us with this topic, we've got an expert who has written about the Scriptural Geologists, has researched and read their writings. Warren Johns. Warren, welcome to Let's Talk Creation. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here, and I feel very welcomed among friends.
Great. That's great. Yes, indeed. Warren, it's great to see you again. This is your first time though on the podcast, but obviously
You're exactly right.
Yeah, but we've known you for a while, and we've certainly read what you've written about the Scriptural Geologists, and so we thought it'd be great to have you on and talk about this really interesting sort of historical movements. So, first of all, before we kind of dig into the topic, because this is your first time on the podcast, why don't you sort of introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners, tell them a bit about who you are, your academic background, and your research interests.
Yes, well, my full name is Warren Harvey Johns. I often publish under the name Warren H. Johns. I've always had an interest in natural science, collecting fossils, bird watching, and pressing flowers, identifying them. So when I entered my formal training, especially college training, I decided to get as much geology and science training as I could. So I studied entomology, study of insects, and I had a class or two in geology, but I was a theological major in college, and I went on to seminary, and I've done some pastoring and done some writing too. But I finally settled down on a long-term career, at least 30 years of work as a theological librarian. And I like the picture of you, Paul, with a nice shelf of books in the background. Yeah. That's another reason I'm right at home. Todd, I don't see your books, but
I have many, I assure you.
I'll give you a little secret. Many of the books that form my research on scriptural geology needed a permanent home, and Todd was more than willing to purchase them, and he has them, and I would urge any of you after the presentation that would like to do further research, visit Todd and Core Academy, and you'll see a wealth of material. Just a little commercial for you, Todd.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we love to have visiting scholars. Anybody who wants to use the library, we have a massive, as you say, massive collection of especially 19th century material. But we have stuff back to the dawn of printing. So, and even before that in reprints. So, come on in, and we would be happy to have you.
Yeah. So as a librarian, I knew how to pursue research in libraries big academic libraries, even as far away as Bodleian Library in Oxford, and then some libraries on the West Coast, Berkeley. I've done some fascinating material is hidden in libraries, and I've been kind of a gleaner, and I've put it all together, and I published my first paper, or first main paper on the topic in Answers Research Journal, 2016. So I guess that's enough introduction.
Oh, that's great. You have a really eclectic background there, and we are always delighted to come across people who are enthusiastic about libraries, because Todd and I are both enthusiastic about our collections, and we
true.
see the value and the importance of these collections. Even though Todd is not with his collection at the moment, he's out in his shed when he records. So, but but do see his fantastic collection if ever you're passing through Dayton. Make an appointment to go and see it. Well, let's talk about these fascinating guys, the Scriptural Geologists. That's what we really got you on the podcast to talk about, Warren. Kick us off by telling us about the Scriptural Geologists. I mean, when did this movement begin? When did it flourish? And who were these people?
Movement started, in my reckoning, precisely in 1822 with the publication of a book on mosaic geology. You mentioned just a little bit ago about the mosaic geologists, meaning they looked to Moses in the Old Testament for their establishing foundation. Well, this book, 1822, was by William Penn. Those of us acquainted with American history know that William Penn, his grandfather, I'm sorry, I mentioned William Penn was not the author, Granville Penn. William Penn was his grandfather who established the colony of Pennsylvania. So he came from some very good roots, and he probably had some money too, so he could publish. His one volume on mosaic geology was expanded to 2 volumes in 1825. And then others jumped on the bandwagon, and we had people even writing books with the title Scriptural Geology or Geology of Scripture. And this really caught people's attention. That was in the 1820s when many of those were published. The movement flourished for 3 decades, and it started waning in 1845, according to Terry Mortenson. I want to pause to give a little commercial about Terry Mortenson. With the Answers in Genesis, currently full-time. He wrote a book called The Great Turning Point. And oh, good, you beat me too.
You guys are prepared.
I was going to show the cover. Yeah, and that's the best summary. Anyone that would like to follow up what we're discussing, order. It's available on Amazon and other venues. The Great Turning Point, subtitled "The Earth's Catastrophic Mistake in Geology." And when we'll get into the question, what happened to the movement, but we're talking about the rise of the movement. And Mortenson's point is well taken, well documented. These were not lay scholars. These were genuinely scholars of their day. Some of them were scientists. For example, Andrew Urey, U-R-E. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but he was a chemist, an accomplished chemist, and published in chemistry. So a lot of them were publishing in fields other than Bible and science. So that covered about 20 years before it started waning, and by the time of Charles Darwin, 1859, the movement was largely extinct, and we'll talk about reasons why it was. So I've given you the answer to the first question. That's when did they flourish?
Yeah. And you mentioned there a few names, Granville Penn and others. One of the scriptural geologists whose name I've come across is George Young. He was the author of a Geology of the Yorkshire coast, I believe. So I mean, these were people who had, at least some of them had some geological competence. Is that right?
Exactly, and I was planning to bring his name up early on. Geology of Yorkshire and the coast there.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, Paul, whether you've actually studied geology there or at least collected there.
I've certainly been to North Yorkshire and seen
you've
the
been there.
coast there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's still world famous to this day, and it's Jurassic, if you want a geological name.
Yeah.
You mentioned George Young. Yes, he was published as a geologist. He was probably the one that deserves more than any other the title Scriptural Geology or geologist. Some of them were clergy, but most of them were not. But all of them had a very strong attachment to their faith and to Scripture. And you might say that's the common thread throughout. And that also becomes the common thread for those of us who are researching and publishing today. Scripture, we take Scripture seriously, and especially the first few chapters of Genesis as a historical document.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me on to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is what did they actually believe? I mean, this term scriptural geology, what did that encompass? What's kind of contained in that term?
Okay. We probably want to contrast them with the non-scriptural or secular geologists of the day. By that time, early 19th century, many of the scientists said, we're going to do our science separate from religion and Bible and so on. And some of them said, oh, yes, we believe in Bible, like William Buckland of Oxford University. But they believed that nature was a second Bible or a second chapter of the Bible. So they separated the two. Some of them, well, let me define scriptural geology in terms of secular geology of that time. The secular approach was to let the findings of geology, which were deemed truthful, help to shed light on the Bible and even reinterpret Scripture. Now, that sounds a little scary to many of us in our background and training. The scriptural geologists flipped it clear around, and they said, let's use the Bible to help reinterpret geology, especially where we feel geology is off track or going the wrong direction. So that, in essence, is how to differentiate. But let's look at two or three fundamental beliefs. One is the Bible is inspired. Two, it's inerrant. Three, its record is historical. The early chapters are not just symbolic. There was an actual creation. Four, because it's historical, the days of creation are literal 24-hour days. Does that sound familiar to those of us who are creationists? Yeah. That's one of the common threads that ties us together with that group. And then five, probably we could add a belief in the universal flood. If the early chapters are historical, then the record of the flood covering the whole earth is reliable, a universal flood. So, and then they go from there.
Yeah. That's very interesting. There are clearly a lot of real echoes there with the modern creationist movement. Were these scriptural geologists known to one another? I mean, was it a kind of coherent, organized group, or were they all just doing their thing independently? How did this movement develop in that sense?
Well, I like your last description. Were they all doing things independently? They thought for themselves. They were independent thinkers. They were not just quoting everyone else's writings on the subject, but their writing was creative and mostly original, except they would quote from the leading geologists and scientists of the day.
Hmm.
So there is no unified movement.
Hmm.
That's at least that's what I've discovered, and I think Terry Mortenson would agree with me. Um, that, in a way, is their strength, because if you're pursuing truth, and every truth seeker is pursuing it in a little different direction, different avenues, but they all kind of arrive at the same basic conclusions, that really strengthens what they're doing. So, yeah, they rarely quoted each other. I found a few places, but rarely. The later ones in the 1850s were quoting the earlier ones. But early on, they were reading each other, and they got ideas about titles of books like Scriptural Geology. But the one that probably was quoted the most was George Fairholm. Fairholm. I always said there are three leading Georges: George Bug, George Fairholm, and George Young, which we've already mentioned. The three Georges are a kind of a trio. If you want to really define the movement, read their writings first and put it together, and so on. Because when you get to the 20th century, these are the ones that are being quoted in the early 20th century by creationists as leading lights, providing a foundation for us in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's interesting that there wasn't really a coherence to this
No.
movement. They were sort of working independently and mostly, at least early on, not sort of citing one another. That's interesting.
Can I jump
So-
in with a comment
Of
here?
course.
Yeah, I
Of
think it's important for everybody to remember the setting, the historical setting of the time.
Good.
This was not an era of universities and colleges on every corner and vast departments of geology and so forth. We talk about the difference between a geologist and a scriptural geologist. Even the definition of a geologist was kind of a blurry kind of a thing. You didn't go and get a geology degree and then get a job in a geology department or working as a geologist. That wasn't a category, right? So it's kind of interesting to try to draw the boundaries here. And I think ideologically is kind of where you're at. And I think that makes sense, because there are those who think, no, the Bible is telling us something true about history, and our theories need to conform to it, versus someone who thinks, well, maybe the Bible just can be reinterpreted based on what we find in nature. But when we talk about geologists in the early 19th century especially, that's a bit of a fuzzy category, realistically.
And I'll jump in to build on what you've said, Todd. Very well said. Most of the early scientists, and I mentioned William Buckland, who was one of the first geologists, worked at Oxford, and he's the one that actually established a museum at Oxford in geology. Most of them were not only believers, but active in their churches' respective communions. And they weren't all Church of England, but most of them were men of faith, which is gratifying to know that you can be a very devout person of faith and still be a good scientist. I
That's
think
right.
that's one of the important lessons that Terry has brought to us in his book, The Great Turning Point.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got these scriptural geologists. They believe in creation, literal 6 days, worldwide flood. They take scripture seriously. They understand it to be recording real history in the early chapters of Genesis. But how did they seek to then integrate their scriptural beliefs with the science of geology? How did they do that? What kind of shape did that take, Warren?
Oh, that's a good question. I need to pause a moment to think about that. That's a very good question. What methodology? I think they're using a methodology of selectivity, um, trust in the Lord for guidance and research, and they tried to pull together what they felt were the best findings of natural science. And they all believe that science is a way of thinking God's thoughts after him. And so, because of their faith, so their method was to not discard science, even though they were described as anti-geologists. No, they used geology. Um, they tried to bring together the best, and with the guidance of the Lord, and with scripture as a foundation. That's how they pursued their research, which isn't much different than creationists today.
Yeah.
Choose the best and go from there.
Yeah. So just to kind of dig down into the specifics of this, we understand today that there is a geological succession, that there is a geological column representing a kind of stack of rocks with fossils, different fossils in different layers, summarized, in that textbook diagram that many people will be familiar with, that geological column. Did they accept that there was a geological succession? I guess the geological column itself was not fully formed at the time that they were writing, but certainly there was an understanding in conventional circles that there was a succession that needed to be explained. Did they reject that, or did they embrace the succession and try to explain it in their sort of biblical framework?
Since they weren't geologists, they had to be trusting in the findings of those who claim to be geologists, like William Buckland. Early on, they accepted the geological sequence. I think that's a very important point, because somehow in the early 19th century, through the writings of a scriptural geologist, George McCready Price, I label him as a modern scriptural geologist.
That's the early 20th century. Sorry, you said the
early 20th century. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
The idea is that we don't accept geology, especially this sequence, because as soon as you accept the sequence, you accept evolution. That's the argument, as you know very well.
Yeah.
They had no problem with the geological sequence, and they even used broad terms, like the transition formations, the primary rocks, the secondary, and the tertiary, and then the diluvial rocks would be at the top. Even secular geologists said what we call Pleistocene, they called it diluvial rocks. And the scriptural geologists accepted that sequence. All of them. I don't know that there was any exception, and there's roughly 40 scriptural geologists that I've identified.
Wow. That's really interesting. Did they assign all of those rocks of the column to the flood, or how did they think about that? Did they think some were pre-flood and so on, just as modern
I was
creationists do?
hoping you would get to that. For a in-depth answer, you need to go to my my article in Answers Research Journal, year 2016, and look up the chart. It has just one chart, and it shows where in the geological column these scriptural geologists put the flood. It often is said that creationists put the whole shebang in a one-year event, but that's misleading. That's not the truth. There's a lot of geological activity before the flood, and there's a lot after the flood. And so they realized that early on. Only one scriptural geologist initially put the whole shebang, the whole geological column with fossils, put it in the year of the flood, and that was the one you mentioned, George Young. But that was early on in the 1820s. And the end of the 1830s, he put the beginning of the flood, I think, approximately when the secondary formations began. And so those are the formations with a lot of vertebrates and skeletons and so on. We call it Mesozoic today. So he would put the beginning of the flood when the first land animals were being killed off. Modern, more or less modern, not totally modern, but a lot of land animals were destroyed, and they call it secondary formations. Most of the scriptural geologists, or half of them at least, put the flood as tied in with the diluvial formation. Diluvial formation, because naturally that's flood, and even the secular geologists, William Buckland, put it diluvial formation in the flood at first, and he wrote a book. His first book was on the Genesis flood and flood geology, but he recanted later on and did totally secular geology. So that's where we're at. Most of them had a hard time figuring out where the flood started, but they all knew it ended in the diluvial formation.
Okay, that's interesting. So again, there are some commonalities there with modern creationists in that there's some discussion, debates about exactly where to place the flood in the record. And there was quite a range of opinion. I remember seeing your paper and that chart that you mentioned, and seeing that they didn't agree about that. Were there other things that they disagreed about, Warren?
Yes, I've been thinking about that. First of all, I want to mention that even though they may have disagreed on things, they respected each other's views, and there was a huge amount of harmony between the scriptural geologists. There were not two camps or three camps. Unfortunately, in some cases, modern creationists not only disagree, but there's a bit of vitriol in their writings. I'm trying to say it judiciously, but I wish we could get rid of that and respect each other more than we do. That's a lesson we could learn.
Yeah, yeah. How were the sort of arguments that these guys were sort of putting forward in their books? How was that received by their contemporaries? Because obviously there were other natural scientists who were not scriptural geologists. You've mentioned those. There were people like Sedgwick and Buckland and others. Did they interact with the scriptural geologists? What did they make of all of this?
There was actually a lot of interaction back and forth. And a lot of the writings of scriptural geologists were they were um, they were a product of reaction of what was written by leading scientists. Edward Hitchcock, American geologist. They wrote against him, trying to point out the flaws in his logic. And so there's a whole book by a scripture geologist. Or they would attack Hugh Miller, a geologist that did a lot on the Devonian and the fishes, Um, they they attacked John Pye Smith, who was a geologist too, a British geologist. So I could go through and name all the reactions. Charles Lyell got a lot of attention. He didn't respond too much, but some of the others, like Hugh Miller, oh, he would go through and spend pages and pages pointing out the flaws in the logic of scriptural geologists and why they're wrong. So there was a lot of back and forth and showing that they took each other's ideas seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that they were interacting in that way and kind of, responding to one another's arguments. Creationists today largely are sort of sidelined, I suppose. There's not so much sort of interaction perhaps, but it's interesting that was happening at that time, that sort of nascent period for the development of geology. These ideas were still all in ferment, and yeah, so that's really interesting. Different kind of context. You mentioned that the movement sort of eventually went into decline and sort of became extinct. What were the factors that led to the movement going into decline? Because it seems like it was quite a short-lived movement. It kind of burned out fairly quickly. So, what was involved in that?
I anticipated that question. So this morning I read a conclusion in Terry Mortenson's book, trying to isolate maybe a list or a series of factors. Mortenson is looking more to the changing winds and currents of British society, largely in Great Britain is where it went extinct. He dates it to 1845. I found a lot of scriptural geologists in the late 1840s and also all through the 1850s. So I've added some more reasons why they went out. Mortenson's main thought is that more and more the churches did not hold the line with the advances of modern science. And they were willing to compromise on all kinds of views, not just in Genesis 1 to 11, but all through Scripture. Churches were influenced by modern society. That's Terry's point. In fact, that's why he has the subtitle of his book, The Church's Catastrophic Mistake in Geology. So that's where he puts a lot of the blame. I will put some blame elsewhere. Number one is that when you may have reached a major conclusion that needs revision, then that sheds maybe some disrespect on what you're doing. People don't trust you if you have to make major changes. The major change I'm thinking of is in the assignment of the diluvium. And, all across Great Britain and the northern states, you have this wonderful blanket of glacial deposits. Well, they're not formed in the flood. And when everyone to a person said they were truly diluvial, Noah's diluvium, then they had to backtrack. And there's a student of run numbers, historian of science, University of Wisconsin. He just died 2 or 3 years ago. Student is Rodney Stiling, Stiling. And he's written in professional journals about the downfall of scriptural geology. He said that the trend was to find more and more of the geological column that was before the flood. And in a sense, you're shoving the flood up higher and higher and higher in the geological record until you put it all the way up into the diluvium. And then when the diluvium is not diluvial, Noah's flood, then their whole argument collapses. That's his
Yeah.
thesis. And it's a pretty good one. I have another one, and that's when I go into the 1850s, and right in the middle, 1856, is a book by Philip Gosse, Gosse.
Yeah. Yes.
Omphalos.
Yes.
Omphalos is the Greek
Yeah.
word for belly button or navel.
Uh-huh.
And he argues from the basis of logic that Adam had a belly button. And because he did, all things that were created maybe with features that we associate with time and post-creation activities. And so tree rings. Trees had tree rings in Eden, right? He would suggest. So creation with apparent age is a big deal. And unfortunately, he said that God created the fossils, all of the fossils, during the 6 days of creation. And that's going to the extreme. And because he went to the extreme, people were throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and no longer could they trust any young earth creationist. That's my thesis. Whether I'm right or wrong, time will tell. But anyway, there were winds of ferment in the 1850s that explain why they went out before Charles Darwin published in 1859. So you cannot blame the theory of evolution for the demise of scriptural geology.
Yes, that's very interesting, isn't it? That it kind of had already declined at that point.
Yeah.
And I was struck by a phrase I think you used in your paper when you were referring to this idea of the flood being kind of pushed higher and higher and higher in the record until it's just in the diluvium.
Yeah.
I think you referred to that as kind of the diminishing flood.
Yeah.
And of course that was William Buckland was famous for, proposing that this diluvial layer was, the product of that was the flood. And of course, when it was reinterpreted as a glacial ice age deposits, then the flood disappeared. The flood vanished.
And that's a good thesis. That's
Yeah.
good.
And I wasn't actually aware, I think, until I'd sort of read your paper about that some of the scriptural geologists were sort of doing that, were sort of pushing the flood up into the diluvium. That had quite sort of, registered with me. Todd, before we move on to think about what are some of the implications of this for us as modern creationists, are there any other sort of questions you just wanted to ask Warren at all at this point?
Well, I'm thinking about evolution, and you do see a decline in scriptural geology, but there's also the factor that it's not a community of people, right? It's not an active research program with a bunch of people coming together regularly to talk about things. This is, I think, one of the reasons creationism in the modern world has been very successful, is we keep coming together and working on things together as a community. And it certainly seems like, evolution may not have killed it, but maybe evolution is why it just didn't resuscitate itself in the 1860s and 1870s, because there were bigger fish to fry, if you will. And maybe if there hadn't been evolution, maybe we would have continued to see sporadically one or two every couple of years, or every decade or so. I don't know. There's definitely a waning, but maybe it wouldn't have disappeared completely for 40 years, basically. I think, Warren, you mentioned 1859 is the last book of the Scriptural Geologists that you have been
58,
able to
59,
identify.
yeah.
Yeah. Which is the same year Darwin's Origin comes out.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I just wonder about that. And it took 40 years before people started putting things back together. Well, 50 really. I mean, Price didn't get going until easily the teens. So,
Exactly.
yeah. So it feels like, there's this time period of sort of readjusting to the new scientific reality and trying to sort of put it all back together again. And people who had a very scriptural bent towards reading the scripture as kind of history kind of got pushed out to the margins of the academic world for reasons that had especially to do with evolution. And honestly, we also have higher criticism. We can't forget that coming up at this time too. So there's a lot of different pressures going on there that I think help to sort of distract people away from geology. Geology, the age of the earth, felt like a much less important subject for a while, at least, until Price really started whipping things back into shape there in the teens and 20s.
Todd, I appreciate your last comments because Darwinism did have a major impact on the pursuit of science, and it made it almost impossible for any new scriptural geologists to arise in the rest of the 19th century.
Yeah.
Because if you have an order to the fossil record, you have an order to the fossils. And theory of evolution, Darwinism, has an explanation, whether it's right or wrong, has an explanation. So you have to deal with that. And so we mentioned George McCready Price in the early 20th century. He wanted to attack evolution more than anything, even more than geology. But to do so, he had to prove that there was no order in the fossil record. And he came up with some really strange ideas that most of them have been debunked by young earth creationists today. So, but he tried, and that was his way of getting in the door and opening it for scriptural geology again.
Yeah. And we see then in the late 19th century, there is a waning of scriptural geology, but there is a blossoming of creationism. There's plenty of people like Alexander Patterson, Luther Tracy Townsend, who come along and start to turn their attention. There's still this commitment to scripture as telling us true revelation about the early history of the world, but it turns away from geology per se to this bigger question of evolution and how do we interpret the fossil record, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And I guess we don't always know for sure what the average person in the pew is thinking about all of this, because they're not the ones who are writing the articles and the books.
Exactly.
And so it's sometimes quite difficult to know what the average Christian at church was still thinking. So maybe, in a sense, scriptural geology didn't go completely extinct, because there were probably people out there who had read these books, been influenced by them, who still accepted those ideas, even though kind of in terms of sort of people writing books, continuing to write books about it, maybe that just didn't happen. So
right. And I feel like
really
Paul, that's a crucial question. And when a historian like Ron Numbers tells us that creationism just died out in the late 19th century, he's looking at academic records. He's looking at the academic world, which is perfectly legitimate place to look. But that doesn't tell us about the total extinction of these ideas, because how else do you explain how it comes roaring back in the 20th century if people had given it up, right? Why would anyone think? People would think, oh, that's a weird 19th century idea. No, they still held to that. It was still quite lively and held and believed in churches. It just wasn't something that was prominent in the university or in college setting or anything like that. And I
Yeah.
think that's another really important issue that we
Yeah.
need to think about as we think about the history of this movement.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, this kind of brings us on then to thinking about how does all of this sort of relate to us today, as modern sort of young age creationists. So we've already touched on some of this, I think, in the conversation so far. But Warren, what would you say are the main sort of similarities and differences between the scriptural geologists and the modern young age creationist movement? How do they relate to one another, do you think?
The main similarity is um, to reinterpret geology, select the best of geology that you can, show that it fits in with Scripture. So today's creationists are scriptural geologists. That's the common denominator. Differences are that we have a lot of new challenges in the 20th century that they never dreamed of. Even Darwinism, going beyond that. Let's let's look at DNA. Let's look at all kinds of things like that. Radioactive dating. Their dating methods were very primitive compared to what the methods are today. So you have that to deal with. So in several areas, you have a lot more information. Another thing is the origin of planet Earth um, and the rest of the planets. Um, you have astrogeology now as a science. They never even thought much about astronomy. It didn't bother them if the universe was old or young. So, but for creationists today, if we accept an old universe, and I'm using the argumentation, and we use the methods to decide the universe is many millions of years old, then we're probably obligated to use those same methods for planet Earth. And if planet Earth, at least the bedrock, is very, very old, what about some of the rock formations and the fossils? So we are in a whole new context, universal context today. We're looking through the microscope at the DNA and the very smallest thing, and we're looking for biomolecules now. This is becoming a big thing among modern creationists to show that life is young. See? And they would have never thought of looking through a microscope to establish the position of creationism. So there's a lot of differences today. A lot of advances as science advanced, creationism has advanced dramatically.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, One of the differences is obviously that the scriptural geology movement, as you've already said, it was quite short-lived. You kind of mentioned it began really in 1822. By 1860, the book stopped being published. The modern creationist movement, of course, has already outlived that. Um, it hasn't sort of fizzled out in the same way. Doesn't really show any signs of doing so imminently, at least. Um, so what lessons can we learn? What are we doing, perhaps, that's ensuring the longevity of our movement that they didn't do? And what lessons can we learn from them about things we perhaps ought to do or not do?
I think one of the first lessons we learn is we really need to spend even more time studying theology. Now, that's my background. I had the chance to go into geology. I was urged to go into um, Pleistocene geology by Pleistocene geologists. He wanted to take me on at the master's level. I could have gone into history of science, University of Maryland. A major professor, is it Francis Haber, wrote a book, The Age of the Earth, from
Yeah.
Moses to Darwin. I would suggest all of you get that because he does describe some scriptural geologists in an academic way, and not
I've got a copy right here somewhere.
yeah. And I've got one in my
Yeah.
library behind me. But so we corresponded. He was willing to take me on. Then I realized
Interesting.
we have some more work to do in theology. So I think that is the lesson that we need to learn and make sure that when we study scripture, that our quotes exegesis are solid. We're using Hebrew and Greek in the right way, and we're quoting scholars in the right way. I think we have to do a little more better work, even in that respect. So,
Yeah.
to me, that's my personal lesson, what I'm learning from this.
Yeah, I think history has a lot of lessons to teach us too. There's a lot of wisdom in the past, especially in science, with ideas that turned out to be not very fruitful, or ideas that were thought of at one point and sort of fell off the radar for a long time. There's a lot to be gleaned from our own history as creationists, and I think that's good motivation to look into some of these scriptural geologists. What were they thinking back then, and why were they thinking it? And what does that tell us about our moment in history that seems so very toweringly important to us right now? But when you think, man, people have been at this scriptural geology thing for 2 centuries now, I think we can, chill out a little bit. God's got this, and we're just part of a community of people advancing his understanding, an understanding of creation that fits with his word. And I think that's
Beautiful.
very encouraging, personally.
Yeah.
Thank you, Todd. I couldn't
Yeah.
have said it any better.
Well, thank you.
And it is interesting, isn't it, to see how the kinds of questions that they were grappling with back then are the same kinds of questions that we're still discussing today about, how much of the record is flood, what's pre-flood, what's post-flood, and so on. It's really interesting that, in one sense, things haven't changed very much. We're still talking about all of those questions. I was going to ask, Warren, to what extent we as young age creationists are heirs of the scriptural geologists, but I think you've kind of already answered that because you said we are scriptural geologists. So we are the intellectual heirs of this movement that kind of went into underwent a kind of eclipse, in the second half of the 19th century, but came roaring back in the 20th. And that I, like Todd says, I think it's really interesting. We should study our history more because there's an awful lot that we can learn about who we are and where we came from and what we're doing today. Where can our viewers learn more about scriptural geologists? Where should they go if they want to find out more?
I've already mentioned Terry Mortenson, but before he wrote his book in 2004, he had a whole series of articles posted online with CMI, Creation Ministries International, and he highlighted about 10 scriptural geologists, if I remember, in separate articles. So those are free online. You can go and look up the name Terry Mortenson. That's a good starting point. And then what I've written, I mentioned in Answers Research Journal. It's kind of hard to find it. Go to the bottom of their opening web page, and all the way down it says Answers Research Journal, and you have to click on that to get to the list of articles. They're all arranged chronologically, so go back to 2016, and I think I'm on page 317 or something. So that would be a good one. But there are actually a fair number of historical works on scriptural geology. One of the earliest by a young earth geologist is Byron Nelson. Um, here's his book,
Yes.
The Deluge Story in Stone. Oh, that must be in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1931. And he highlights George Fairholm and a couple other scriptural geologists. So if you want to read up from an early viewpoint, that's good. Another source, if you get a list of the names of the scriptural geologists, go to McIver's book, Thomas McIver, Anti-Evolution, an annotated bibliography. As I mentioned, scriptural geologists were called anti-geologists. And this one has some nice summaries of all of the scriptural geologists. So make a list, go to the bibliography of my article and Terry Mortenson, make a list of at least 10 or 15 of the scriptural geologists, and then go to Tom McIver. His bibliography is excellent.
That's great.
And there's a lot of other sources.
We will definitely put links to the items in our show notes. So if they're online, we'll put links and we'll refer to some of the other published materials. I'm sure we'll do that in our show notes. So yeah, viewers, if you want to go and find all of that, hopefully that will be there already kind of collated for you. Warren, I just want to say a big thank you, because that has been a really fascinating conversation. The scriptural geologists I find endlessly fascinating.
Yeah.
I wish there. I know you can get sort of modern reprints of their works and things like that, but I'd love to have a collection of their original books there in my library. Unfortunately, I don't, and they're rather rare and rather expensive to buy. But yeah, we should definitely go back and restudy the writings of our intellectual forebears. Yeah, it's great conversation, Warren. We really are appreciative of all of your research and for sharing it with us today. And thank you again for joining us.
And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for the invitation, the privilege of interacting with you.
Oh, well, it's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. Okay. We will be back in another couple of weeks. Join us then for more fascinating stuff on Let's Talk Creation. But it's bye for now from Todd and me. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
See you around.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.